welcome back into Cherry Picking. Today's video, we're going to be looking at players you should be pressing the panic button on or not pressing the panic button on. Essentially, all guys that have really struggled to start the year so far. We're about a month into the season, so it's time to start looking at your team to see where the shit players are, maybe get rid of them, see which players have maybe underperformed, try to sell high on them. So yeah, never better time to start making some trades in fantasy hockey. As always, the video presented by FanDuel Canada, North America's #1 sportsbook. Link in the description to download that app, get betting on the NHL. Let's get into the video for today. 4 players we're going to be talking about to see if we're either going to be pressing the panic button or safe. They're going to be safe for the rest of the season. All right, so the first guy we're looking at, Noah Dobson on the New York Islanders, was one of the better fantasy hockey defensemen last season and having a really disappointing season so far, along with the Islanders as well. They've had a lot of injuries too, but through 15 games, has just 6 assists. He's pointless in his last six games. The one thing you can be, I guess, happy about as a Noah Dobson fantasy hockey owner, his shots on goal are still really high, which is one good thing to see. But you looking at his ranks amongst defensemen this year, it's not that reassuring. Like 106th ranked amongst defensemen in hits with just 13, 52nd in block shots with 28, 4th, as I mentioned, in shots with 49, almost 50 shots on goal in 15 games played, and then 22nd amongst defensemen in individual expected goals for created. His fantasy finish last season, 5th amongst defensemen in fantasy points. He had 80 plus points, 200 plus shots, 100 plus block shots. Right now, he's on pace for 33 points with 6 assists through 15 games. So that's definitely not reassuring. His on-ice expected goals for percentage, 9th on the team at 57%. Last year, it's 53%. So you could see that, you could argue that he is playing, or that the Islanders are maybe playing a little bit more offensive, but maybe they're lacking the skill to maybe score, but he's certainly not creating, I would say, the same amount of individual offense as we saw last year, especially early in the season. I would definitely be panicking a little bit. However, I don't really think you could trade him for the value that he's currently at. So you kind of just have to keep him and just hope that the Islanders get better. I can't see them getting much worse at this point. Barzal's going to come back. Duclair's going to come back. Pellick's going to come back. As this team gets healthier and Patrick Roy gets more time with this team, I think the team will only get better. I think that would obviously help Dobson. He's still very involved. The shot volume's still there. So we're hovering, our hands hovering over the panic button for Noah Dobson right now. But if it goes any further, there's really not going to be anything else you could do other than just keep him on your bench, because you can't really drop him. He's 97% rostered. So definitely a tough one. We're hovering over it at this point, because if you have him right now, you can't trade him. One guy a lot of people have certainly been panicking about, and it's for good reason. It's Elias Pettersson on the Vancouver Canucks. So far, through 13 games this season, just 3 goals, 4 assists. People will be like, whoa, that's not bad. Well, obviously, if you know who Elias Pettersson is that's pretty bad. Considering last year through 13 games, he's actually leading the NHL in points with 7 goals, 17 assists, 33 shots. I think he was top 5 in individual expected goals for created. Just having a really good start to the season, which he cannot say the same for this season. Last year, by the end of the season, looking at the Canucks, and people talked about it throughout the season, you could see there was some sort of offensive regression coming. I think you saw it a little bit in the playoffs, but you're certainly seeing it this year. JT Miller and Elias Pettersson had 2 of the highest on-ice shooting percentages last year at 15%. It's something Pettersson has always had very high, higher than the league average, just because he creates so much offense, he's such a good playmaker, and he has such a good shot. So it's a really good combo of 3 things that obviously create the ability to score at a very efficient rate. But I think they were very due for some offensive regression. We're seeing it this year, and the lack of volume that they had last year is hurting them this year as well. And the same thing goes for Elias Pettersson. His shots on goal are down. 24 shots on goal so far this year through 13 games. Not even 2 per game at this point. He's ranked 185th amongst forwards. You know, one thing as a center, especially in fantasy hockey, that you kind of need to have in the back of your mind, especially if your league counts it, and that's face-off wins. Right now, he has 78. That's 66th amongst centers right now. Looking at his stats last year, obviously it's way more, it could be reassuring, because you'd be like, oh, well, he was at this point last year, had the ability to be a 30-point player or 25-point player in a 13-game span. And he certainly has that ability to do it again this year. The Canucks have just really fell flat this year. You know, Demko's hurt. They haven't really had any momentum. They've been terrible at home. But I think we'll see a little bit of a pivot here, because their roster didn't totally change from last year. You know, Besser's hurt right now too, which obviously doesn't help JT Miller in that line. So a lot of the onus does end up falling on Pettersson. But Pettersson's too skilled of a shooter, and we saw it last year how good this offense operated at its peak peak point that you have to trust it. I would not panic on Pettersson. I wouldn't try to trade him. He will bounce back. He's an incredible playmaker, an incredible shooter. Last year at this point, I mentioned he had 7 goals, 17 assists. Shooting percentage was 21%. He's always had a high shooting percentage, but his shooting percentage is down to 13% this year. So that's an 8% difference, obviously, just year over year in a 13-game span from the start of the season. So I think we're going to see some positive regression for Elias Pettersson, especially when this team gets healthier and into a little bit of more of a groove here as the season progresses. All right, Wyatt Johnson on the Dallas Stars, a guy that a lot of people were high on this year, was going much earlier in drafts this season than he was last year, because last year was definitely his breakout year, and he started off really hot last season. This year, not the same. 2 goals, 5 assists in 14 games played so far. Last year, through the same amount of games, 14 games, 7 goals, 6 assists. So, over 10 points. He has yet to reach that mark. This year, his shooting percentage was 22%. This year, it's 5% through his first 13 games. So that just happens. It's just the game of hockey. However, very talented shooter, a guy who creates a lot of offense. And this year, his individual expected goals for number is actually higher than it was last season at this point. And I think a lot of it has to do with the line he's playing on. He played a lot with Jamie Benn and Logan Stankoven last season as well, especially near the beginning of the season. And they created offense at a very high rate. They are not creating offense at the same rate. I think it would be a little naive to say that they would be able to, considering it was like a brand new duo. I think it was just fresh. The chemistry was clicking. I don't think it was necessarily something that was going to be consistent. Johnson ended up playing with Robertson and Hintz in the playoffs. Ended up being a really successful line. For whatever reason, Peter DeBoer continues to put Wyatt Johnson with Jamie Benn and Stankoven, even though the numbers this year in the small amount of time that they've played together have been really reassuring for the trio of Hintz, Robertson, and Johnson. So I think for Johnson to get back into his groove, needs to be put on that line. And I think that's the reason why we're seeing his individual expected goals for so much higher this year. He's taking on more personal responsibility. If he plays with those other 2 guys, I think the responsibility gets dwindled down a little bit more, but he'll still obviously be put in more positions scoring, playing with 2 elite players like Rupe Hintz and Jason Robertson. So I'm not panicking on Wyatt Johnson either. He's way too young to be panicking at this point. They're going to go through slumps, or he's going to go through slumps. The Dallas is going to continue to score at a very high rate. Hopefully he gets put on the right line, but even if he is playing on the Stankoven-Benn line, he will find his footing and be able to score again. So do not give up on Wyatt Johnson. All right, the last guy we're going to be either pressing the panic button on or not is Charlie McAvoy on the Boston Bruins, a guy who's been a staple in fantasy hockey drafts for the past 5 or 6 seasons, always near the top 8, I would say. But so far this year, the Boston Bruins and McAvoy have been disappointing. Through 16 games, he has just 2 goals, 2 assists to show for it, 4 points. Is Boston just maybe bad now? Has their time come where they're finally going to maybe miss the playoffs? I think their roster has significantly gotten worse over the past 3 seasons consistently. You lose Bergeron, Krejci, you lose guys like Matt Grzelcyk, I believe he's not on the team anymore either. Is that what I'm thinking of? Even, I know you pick up someone like Hampus Lindholm, it was years ago. Obviously, Torrey Krug was on the team. Taylor Hall was on the team. Jake DeBrusk is off the team. Linus Ullmark, Tuukka Rask. And they haven't replaced as well as I found as years past. They've done a pretty good job, but not as good. But back to Charlie McAvoy. Maybe it's his partner this season. Maybe it's his partner. That's the reason why he hasn't been able to produce, and you can blame maybe a little bit of it because last year he had a pretty solid season, and him and Lindholm played virtually the entire season together, or they played the most minutes together at a very successful rate. One of the best pairs who played 300 plus minutes together, one of the most efficient pairs, defensively and offensively. But this year, he's played far more with Nikita Zadorov for whatever reason, and I don't think that pair obviously has the same amount of chemistry as Hampus Lindholm does. So if he's not scoring, if he's not clicking as much with his pair, can he carry his production through shots, blocks, and hits? So far this year, 22nd amongst defensemen in hits with 27, 83rd amongst defensemen in block shots with 23, 29th amongst defensemen in shots with 30, and individual expected goals for. He's outside the top 30. And this is a guy who's playing 24 to 25 minutes a game. Through 16 games last season, as I mentioned, 4 points this year through 16 games. This year, 3 goals, 9 assists, 35 shots, an individual expected goals for number of 2.7, 29 hits and 32 blocks. So across the board, his numbers are worse this season in every single stat category. His on-ice expected goals for percentage this year, 53%. Last season through 16 games, 58%. So Boston as a whole last year was creating more offense when he was on the ice. This year, you're seeing that number reduced by 5%. So yeah, I would be panicking with Charlie McAvoy if I spent a high pick on him. It doesn't seem like Boston's in the same category as they were last year. Maybe you could say the same for Charlie McAvoy at this point, especially when it comes to fantasy hockey terms. So at this point, what do you do with him? You could still try to trade him. Maybe you don't like kind of a stretch, but if you really want to hold on to McAvoy for a little bit, maybe trade him for like a guy like Vince Dunn. Maybe try to get Brandon Montour if you can for Charlie McAvoy at this point. There's a lot of different routes you can go. If you're in a league where, you know, draft picks matter, if you're in keepers, package him with a draft pick as well. But yeah, I would try to get Charlie McAvoy off my team at this point. I don't see the up arrow being enticing enough to keep him on a roster spot at this point with knowing the draft stock and value that I put into him at the beginning of the year. All right, thank you guys for tuning in. Let me know what you thought of players to panic on to start the fantasy hockey season. You know, 2 players not to panic on, 2 players to panic on. Shout out to FanDuel Canada for sponsoring the video. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.